Today's episode of Variant is brought to you by Domain.com.
Today on Variant, I tell you all you need to know about the new Star Wars continuity and timeline. Welcome to Variant, where we love comics more than I wish I had a real pair of web shooters. I'm your host, Arris. Now, over the last 2 months, I've done several Star Wars themed episodes, but I have yet to break down the new Star Wars continuity and timeline. So today I'm going to tell you about all the Star Wars comic books, novels, cartoons, movies, etc. that are currently in Star Wars continuity. I'm also going to elaborate a little bit on where they fit in the timeline. Now, all this might be a little confusing, so try to stay with me. Let's start from the beginning of the new Star Wars continuity and timeline. It all started when Disney acquired Lucasfilm and bought the rights to Star Wars back in 2012. Since then, the Star Wars canon and universe has completely been redefined, recategorizing most of the previous extended storylines from the books, comics, video games, etc. under the Star Wars Legends banner. Disney then started the task of filling in the timelines in between the stories that remained in canon, essentially rewriting the Star Wars mythos as well as expanding it by partnering the new Star Wars team at Lucasfilm with the amazing people over at Marvel Comics, which of course is also owned by Disney. Because, well, Disney owns the world. From this partnership, we've gotten several new comic book series that feature both old Star Wars characters and new ones, and have started to build a very solid foundation for the future of the Star Wars universe. A lot of the new storylines fill in the timeline gaps between the main episodes, showing the events and characters during the space of time in between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, and so on and so forth. By doing this, Disney and Lucasfilm have done a great job of setting the stage to revisit past timelines and give us new stories that bring back some of our favorite characters like Yoda, Han Solo, Darth Vader, and the list goes on. The comics and novels with the banner Journey to Star Wars The Force Awakens also give a much broader and more realistic look at the effects of the political and personal ramifications of events including the ultimate defeat of the Empire and the Star Wars galaxy as a whole. For instance, we get our first detailed look at the aftermath of the events in Return of the Jedi and the continued battle to restore the galaxy in the comic Star Wars Shattered Empire and the novel Star Wars Aftermath. The only downside to all this is that with all these different titles, it can be hard to figure out where to start and what is what. And that's where I come in, friends. I'm going to try my best to make an easy to understand guide of all the Star Wars comic books, novels, cartoons, and so on that are currently in continuity with the Star Wars films, as well as tell you where they fit into the timeline. And since I love comic books more than anything, basically, let's start with the Star Wars comic books. The only logical comic to start with is the main Star Wars comic book titled, you guessed it, Star Wars. It takes place between the events of Episode 4, A New Hope, and Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. This series more closely follows events from the side of Luke, Han, Leia, and the rest of the rebels after the Battle of Yavin and the destruction of the Death Star in Episode 4, but prior to the events of Episode 5. We learn that Luke Skywalker's confrontation with Vader in Empire Strikes Back is not the first, and we get to see the first time the two square off. While Luke is no match for Vader, he manages to escape, and it's in this confrontation that Vader first realizes there's more to this rebel pilot than he thought. This leads Vader to hire the bounty hunter Boba Fett to track and capture the boy wielding his old lightsaber. The Star Wars series is actually one of my favorite comic book titles of 2015. It's just all around a solid comic book. We also have the Darth Vader comic, which I'm enjoying a lot. The comic follows the same timeline as the Star Wars title, but in this book we shadow Vader and see the events from the side of the Galactic Empire. As punishment for his failure to retrieve the plans for the Death Star stolen by rebel spies, which led to its destruction, Vader is demoted by Emperor Palpatine and loses his place in the Emperor's inner circle. Despite the Emperor placing him under the command of General Tag, a pissed off Vader begins to pursue his own interests and hires the bounty hunter Boba Fett to find the rebel pilot who carries his old lightsaber and fired that fatal shot at the Death Star. And in one of my favorite moments in the book, we get to see when Vader learns that the Emperor lied to him about Padme being dead and that the rebel pilot is actually his son. Then we have Princess Leia, which was a 5-issue miniseries. It takes place immediately after the rebel victory over the Empire with the destruction of the Death Star in Episode 4. We follow Princess Leia as she finally begins to cope with the loss of her homeworld Alderaan after being forced to watch its destruction. Leia is trying to make peace with the loss of her people, but learns that the Empire has placed a large bounty on her head and is also hunting any surviving Alderaanians in response to the Alliance's actions. The book is also written by the great Mark Waid and drawn by the amazing Terry Dodson. Moving along yet again, we have Kanan the Last Padawan. It introduces us to Caleb Dume, the Jedi Padawan who fought in the Clone Wars along alongside his Jedi Master, until most of the Jedi were slaughtered at the hands of the clone troopers and Anakin Skywalker under Imperial Order 66. Caleb manages to survive the massacre and goes on the run, eventually changing his name to Kanan Jarrus and posing as a smuggler, in an attempt to evade the Imperial forces seeking to purge any remaining Jedi. Caleb/Kanan's story bridges the timelines between the fall of the Jedi and the Republic in Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith and the events in Star Wars Rebels. We also get to see the birth of the rebellion against the Empire that eventually grows into the Rebel Alliance. Then we have Chewbacca, which is a 5-issue miniseries. It takes place after the destruction of the Death Star. Chewbacca sets out on a personal mission when he accidentally crash lands his ship on the Outer Rim planet of Andum 4. Soon after, he puts his personal mission aside to help a young woman named Zaro free her people. Then we have Star Wars Shattered Empire, which is a 4-issue miniseries that's part of the Journey to Star Wars The Force Awakens banner, which I was talking about earlier. This 4-part series bridges the timeline between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens, and is a very important part to new Star Wars canon. There's also Lando, which is another 5-issue miniseries. This series takes place prior to the events of Episode 5 and Episode 6, where we're first introduced to Lando. So this comic gives us a new in-canon look at Lando as a gambler and smuggler who is deep in debt to a crime boss named Papa Torrin. We also have the Obi-Wan and Anakin title. This comic focuses on Obi-Wan and Anakin before their tragic battle on Mustafar and many decades before their final confrontation on the Death Star. So basically it follows their adventures before Anakin turns into Darth Vader, which in turn leads him to killing Obi-Wan. It's a nasty situation. And lastly, for the comic books at least, we have a title that was just announced, Star Wars Poe Dameron, who's the new breakout star from The Force Awakens. The comic will focus on the X-Wing pilot's backstory leading up to The Force Awakens, and it launches in April. Now, does all this sound like a lot of information so far? That's because it is. And that's just the comic book side of things. Now let's talk about the novels. You have Star Wars Aftermath. Aftermath reveals what happened after the events of Return of the Jedi. It turns out there's more than just the Empire for the good guys to worry about. Then we have Star Wars Before the Awakening. Star Wars Before the Awakening is an anthology book that focuses on the lives of Rey, Finn, and Poe before the events of Star Wars The Force Awakens. We also have Star Wars Lost Stars. This novel gives readers a macro view of some of the most important events in the Star Wars universe, from the rise of the rebellion to the fall of the Empire. We experience these major moments through the eyes of 2 childhood friends who have grown up to become an Imperial officer and a rebel pilot. Now, I haven't read this novel or any of the others, but they sure do sound really cool. Now, I talked about the comics and novels that are in current Star Wars canon, but let's talk about some cartoons. You have Star Wars The Clone Wars, which is an animated television series set between the events of Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones and Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith. And it's during the same time period as the earlier series Star Wars Clone Wars, which is sometimes confused with the aforementioned Star Wars The Clone Wars. Then we also have Star Wars Rebels. It's an animated television series set 5 years before the events of the original Star Wars trilogy, during the time frame between the film Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith and Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope. As far as video games go, we have Star Wars Battlefront. It starts around Episode 4 A New Hope and is a fantastic video game. Battlefront spans the gamut of the movies, with maps set from Return of the Jedi's Endor, Tatooine, Volcanic Sullust, and other worlds. The constant conflicts showing the regular battles between Rebel and Imperial forces that took place in the background of the Civil War. And this, my fellow Star Wars fans, brings us to the new Star Wars film, Star Wars Episode 7 The Force Awakens, which I don't think I have to explain or even talk about much because, quite frankly, almost everyone in the world has seen this movie by now. I will say, however, it takes place 30 years after the defeat of the Galactic Empire, and now the galaxy faces a new threat from the evil Kylo Ren and the First Order. Then we have this year's Star Wars movie, Rogue One. It will follow a band of rebel fighters who steal the plans for the first Death Star. It's set between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. This movie could also bring back freaking Darth Vader, because Anakin is already Vader at this point in the timeline. I'd actually be really shocked if Vader isn't in this movie. Star Wars Rogue One will also do what no other Star Wars movie has ever done, which is put the main focus on the regular non-Force driven characters, setting the stage for the upcoming Han Solo film. And just like that, my friends, that is my summary of current Star Wars continuity and where it fits within the Star Wars timeline. There are some other little things in Star Wars canon I didn't mention, like Star Wars kid books and some other novels, etc. Basically, there's a lot of Star Wars content out there. I pretty much covered all the big pieces, but it's a constantly evolving world that will always have more comic book titles, cartoons, novels, movies, video games, and so on added to its universe. But I hope I helped you guys understand what's in Star Wars continuity a little bit better. When you buy a domain name from domain.com, you get the power to influence and control what people find when they search for you online. No domain extension will help you tell your story like a .com or .net domain name. Domain.com is affordable, reliable, and easy to use. The guys at Domain.com gave Variant an awesome offer. Get 15% off Domain.com's already affordable domain names and web hosting when you use the coupon code Variant at checkout. So when you think domain names, think Domain.com. First up for January 27th, we have Canon issue 10. I talked about this title earlier in the episode, and it's a really fun read. Now we have We Are Robin issue 8. The Robin War is over, and from the rubble, a new force rises. One that is attacking Duke, and the Robins one by one. And finally, we have Suicide Squad Most Wanted Deathshot and Katana issue 1. Two of the stars from this year's highly anticipated action movie break out in their own solo adventures in this extra-sized 6-issue miniseries. And just like that, that brings another episode of Variant to a close. But remember, you can always like our Variant Facebook page to keep up with the show and all things comic related. You can also follow Variant on Twitter at Variant Comics or me on Twitter at Arris_Quinones. But I'll see you guys next week. We'll talk about all things comics. Welcome to Variant, where we love comics more than I wish Tim would silence his phone. I'm your host. Boom. Boom.